Hello and welcome to Upper Pen. My name is Dakota, and today I am talking with Jared, the long-winded one, about his book, The Children of the Cold Moon, which is the first book in the Four Treasures saga. So thank you so much for being here, Jared.
Thanks for having me. I'm not usually on this side of the microphone. I guess I am on this side of the microphone, but I'm usually the one doing the interviewing. And this is the first time that I've been on camera as the long-winded one. So I'm happy to be here with you, as always.
Well, um, thank you for being here. And we'll get to your podcast in a little bit because I'll ask you a little bit about that. But can you tell folks what the Children of the Cold Moon is a little bit about?
Yes, and in fact, would you mind? So on my copyright page, I have just a couple of sentences that
Do
I
it.
think describes it very well. This is not historic fiction. This is not a retelling of Irish myth. It is instead a collection of mythological figures and monsters put into a blender and sprinkled onto a lit RPG landscape. I have added, subtracted, edited, and borrowed from other Celtic myth in the process of creating this story. This is not meant to detract from history, mythology, or scholarship. It is meant to be fun. And that's, I think, it is. I started writing about something that I knew, which was Dark Age Welsh history, which is, I had never really studied Irish history. My family's Scotch-Irish, so I have it in me. But I mean, these are the places that I've been. These are the standing stones from chapters one and two. These are the old stone structures that people would have lived in that Bryn falls into in the first couple of chapters. And that's what I knew, right? Because I had been there. I had seen the sunrise behind those druid stones. And it slowly evolved into something with structure. And Irish mythology provided that structure. It is unlike anything that I think popular culture is familiar with. And feel free to, there's a reason they call me the long-winded one. Feel free to cut
Oh,
me
you're good.
off if you want to. But so, we're used to the Rick Riordan's, I mean, even like Asgardian mythology, but Greek and Roman, even some Egyptian at this point, where there's one god of a particular domain or aspect, and that's just not the way Celtic mythology was. So I needed a frame to tell my story, and Irish mythology kind of had that, although it is there's no one telling of any particular myth for the most part, right? Everything was
Mhm.
passed down by word of mouth until the Christians came, and then they changed things a little bit and added things and subtracted things. And one of the things that I have deviated from was, I was like, okay, I need to create something that people can wrap their head around. And in Celtic mythology, Brigid might have, you know, three or four different domains, right? Fertility and it goes on and on and on. But I wanted it simple, and I wanted it to be something palatable for people. So I kind of made it a little bit like the mythologies that people are familiar with. And so we have this main character who is more than meets the eye. And who gets, as this caretaker who's also more than meets the eye, and he gets sucked into the Celtic otherworld. And yes, I used Irish mythology to kind of frame it in terms of like a pantheon. But there's, even the last name of the bodyguard, Fairy, the Athlathan, is a Welsh word, right? The bar that they go into, Unseelie, is a classification in Welsh, right? I believe. So there's a lot borrowed. The Tectun, the volcano that represents the sort of the land of the dead. That's a real name for an island off the Isle of Man, I believe. So there's a little bit of everything. Is that too much? That's a little too much, more than you wanted to know,
Oh,
probably.
no, that's perfect. So how did you integrate these lit RPG elements into this quasi myth landscape?
Yeah. Well, so let me start with a disclaimer, and I probably should have had a disclaimer on the book. On Royal Road, when you write, a lot of authors will put, "Here's what you can expect from the story," right? I didn't put that in my story. I probably should have. But if you are a super crunchy person, and we've all read those books,
Yeah.
right? This story is not for you because it is not super crunchy. There's not a skill for like toasting, having breakfast, right? There's um, if I could sort of drill down what I believe lit RPG to be, and I think people would define it differently, um, is that there is a system, right? There are some game-like mechanics. If you're like in a game-like world, I think you're crossing over into game lit. But I think some people would argue that I think Robert Bevan on one of my interviews said, yeah, I think lit RPG is like basically just like game lit, except for people who don't want it to be called game lit. So there's real definitions I know that people believe in, but for me, I think like lit RPG is like there's like a kind of a system, right, where that is kind of like governing things, and character. There's aspects of progression fantasy where characters sort of level up, but to what degree you're comfortable with that, mine is very light. And so my system in this case is the god of magic. And you could be like, well, how does that work? And that's a very good question. But the God of Magic has kind of put his stamp on everything, including the magic of the other world. And sometimes that doesn't, he can't communicate from the other world to Eru, which is what they call Earth, which is named after the patron goddess of Ireland. But the minute the cold moon, or the long night as they're calling it, which is when the full moon happens on the winter solstice. Um, there's a bit of like an influx of the weave of the magic from the other world, and he hears the god of magic's voice for the first time, and he's like, what the hell is this? And then eventually he goes to the other world, and he hears it all the time. But for me, you're asking about lit RPG, and I think, there are other parts to lit RPG that I love that I think is not in the classical definition. And people who have listened to my podcast will, you know, will have heard this a couple of times, but I think lit RPG doesn't take itself very seriously most of the time, right? It is very serious literature, and I've said this before. People listen to it, on their very hard commutes, when they're going to visit people in the hospital, and they use this literature to lift themselves up, and to, we listen to things that we love, right? Things
Yeah.
that make us laugh, things that make us cry. So it's very serious in that respect, but it pokes fun at itself. At least what I listen to does. Yeah, there's a lot of pop culture references because a lot of times isekai overlaps with lit RPG, right? So you have this narrator who is being transported from our world with references that we will understand, or at least we will understand for the next 20 years. And they're put into this world, and so it's funny, it's light, it doesn't take itself very seriously. Pop culture references, to me, this makes up lit RPG, at least the lit RPG that I love.
I think there are two different types of RP or lit RPG. So there's like American lit RPG, and then there's Russian lit RPG or Eastern Europe lit RPG, which um, seems much more, in my opinion, like war and battle um, uh,
Battle
pervasive,
focused.
I guess.
Yeah.
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 And that one I think doesn't take itself as Um, it's not as silly as American Lit RPG, but I do really enjoy like the two different styles that you can feel. So I really like that idea that like it just, I don't know. I like Lit RPG because it is so vast, you know?
Hmm.
Um,
Right. And I have obviously gone down a rabbit hole, like in a very particular,
yes.
I mean, here we go. There's some Matt Damon reference for you there. But obviously I like the funny.
Yeah.
Um, and that's what I hopefully comes across. This isn't not laugh out loud. It's not meant to be that kind of book, but we have this snarky narrator who is up until like a few days ago was living the high life, kind of a selfish character. And I've actually gotten this feedback. I don't know what it is, but people are, they expect, progression fantasy to me is not just about getting more powerful. It's about evolving as a character, right?
Yeah.
Some books do have the characters start off as like super powerful and they stay super powerful, but like my narrator starts off selfish. He starts off like, upset that he got up so early, upset that he had to do a hike, right? Like, he wasn't sure what was going on in his world, and he's meant to develop into like a full person.
Well, so I I don't necessarily see him as selfish so much as just young.
Yeah,
Um, so he's like 23, 24 in the book.
he's 22, so yeah,
22. Yeah,
yeah,
so he's very young and I don't know. I don't see it as selfishness so much as lack of experience. And boy, does he get experience as soon as he travels into the other realm.
yeah.
Um,
Anun is what we call it, and that is also a Welsh, I believe, Welsh derived name for the other world.
really? So this is an actual
I
word that
believe
you,
so. Yeah.
oh my gosh. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
A noon.
Yeah. A N. Oh gosh, now I'm gonna mess it up. I can type it, but I can't spell it in my head.
I'm just gonna say a
There's actually
noon.
no Anun. Yeah.
Um, so I really love that you do have these like Aru and Anun as two separate type of entities. And I don't know, there's a lot to love in this. But going back to what you said about this not being crunchy, um, I, especially as an entry into Lit RPG, crunchy, in my opinion, is not accessible. Um, and it, for me, it can pull me out of the story if it's too often, you know? So,
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And I don't know if you had more. I don't mean to cut you off,
no,
but
you're
I
good.
I want I wanted to say as not only as like an entry level reader, but as an entry level writer, right? I've written kids books, but I've never written a full length novel, and so I needed something that I was trying to tell a story, and you know, trying to for the first time roll into these to this book like lit RPG elements. And so I needed to start with the place that was manageable for me. Could the story exist without any of the crunch? Definitely. But that's not that's not what I was going for. That's not what I love. And I think it's a part of watching the character develop, right? That's as he levels up in the book, and as he compares himself to other people, right? There's definitely like it's a big part of the book.
Well, so it's also very helpful as a reader entering a new world because I like he'll do something and usually he'll get the announcement afterwards about what this is. And like in my head, I'm like, oh, you can use those stones to like make a barrier. And then he makes a barrier and he's like, I don't know what the hell just happened.
Yeah.
And then you do this wonderful thing with the crunch and explaining what that is and how it's manifesting. So I think that's a really good way of explaining what's happening without just info dumping from other characters.
Yeah, I really try. I have a chapter that's called the Treatise of Tedium. And I actually got that term from Michael Drought. He's a professor of, well, he's a professor of literature at Wheaton College. But I interviewed him about Tolkien, and he was like, chapter two of any fantasy or science fiction novel is the Treatise of Tedium. It's where you dump all of the information about the technological system, the family tree of the pantheon, whatever it is, the magic system, and I kind of poke fun at that in chapter five of my book, and I really tried not to do that. I really tried to space it out, and I think for some people it was like, when are you going to tell me what's going on? But yeah, and so so Bren is the main character, and Bren, it's weird. Like in a lot of lit RPG books, you know, they're presented with an option, and then they have to make a choice, right? And so you kind of get the notification first before
Mhm.
the powers are used. His powers don't always work like that. They do later, and there he reaches a milestone where there is choice involved. But for the early levels, um, like his power manifests to save him a lot of times, like you described.
I think that's very um it's very well done because when you think about magic, I would assume most magic is self-preservation. And for him, he is Bambi on ice a lot of the time. He's like, I have
Yeah,
no idea what's happening and I'm gonna
yeah,
fall.
yeah.
So,
And there's that's not the way it works for the Tua,
mhm.
the
Yeah.
Tua Dadanan, which is like the main family, the offspring of the mother goddess Danu. And so when they're trying to figure out who this Bren character is, right? Because he's not always surrounded by friends a lot of times. And when he really starts developing, he goes off by himself or is pulled away, and then he has to start figuring this stuff out. They're trying to figure out who he is because Mother Danu hasn't had an offspring, a first gen offspring in a long time. And they're like, yeah, his powers like, come different, like manifest differently than ours. And being told from first person, you really get a sense of like confusion. Like and then you have these other characters that are sprinkled in there that are like, well, it could be this or it could be this. And as the reader, that's what I was kind of hoping is like you would, take your own shot at guessing what it was.
I think you do really well with the mystery of who is the bad guy. And is there a bad guy, right? Is there actually one bad opinion? Um, and so like those sprinkles of like, do you know what's happening yet was wonderful.
Thank you. I don't want to give anything away, but I will say that this tries to be a realistic version. That sounds strange for a fantasy novel, but a realistic version of what it means to be good and bad, right? Where you're expecting like someone to look mean and ugly and like do terrible things to people, and sometimes those things are done by the people that aren't mean and ugly. And sometimes the people that are doing bad make it sound like it's good. And also like sometimes you can't obviously you can't just label one group of people good or bad, right?
Mhm.
And so that's what I try to get across here. But thank you for saying that.
Yeah, you did really well. And I like nuance. Like I love Sauron and like Saruman, but like sometimes I need there to be nuance.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. It's funny you mentioned Sauron. I have Tolkien art littering. I don't believe in the term man cave because that implies that you want to escape from your family. But this is our guest room, and this is where I do all the podcasting and where I play D&D. And so I have past characters that I've commissioned artwork for all over. I have Elos Tyrion, which is something that I tried to paint, which is well, it doesn't matter. I could talk Tolkien all day, but I have a picture of Sauron that my kids drew me for, or painted me actually, and the door of uh, Moria.
Yeah, more.
Yeah, yeah. So
That's That's awesome. I love that your kids are involved.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it kind of rubs off on them a little bit.
Uh,
I had my before my youngest was born, I believe. I had my two oldest on the podcast once. This was at the heart of, I guess my youngest must have been born. This was at the heart of the pandemic, and I saw Jimmy Fallon having his kids on the Tonight Show, and I was like, well, if he can do it, I'm going to do it. And so that episode's called my most beloved stars.
aw.
And that was a fun episode, where kids were talking about like, do you know what Daddy does? Do you know what a podcast is? And do you know what he talks about? And I was at the time I was reading The Hobbit with my daughter, so she was super into it.
My dad read me Lord of the Rings when I was a kid, so I feel the love.
Yeah. Well, my kids are into lit RPG now, so
Oh,
yeah, yeah.
I hear a lot of people ask what kind of lit RPG is acceptable for kids, right? Like if you want to get a kid into it, what do you suggest?
Well, let me put a plug in for Children of the Cold Moon. No, I actually did write it so that kids could listen to it. There's a couple of swear words, but I made up swear words like Ryan Rimmel did, so that my kids could listen to it. So that when they're saying a swear word, it's not really a swear word. Um, but I think I've talked to, and I know you've talked to these people too, but Eric Uglin used to be that the bad guy series of all things could be listened to from the kid's point of view. Now there's you would argue there's violence and stuff, but he had written I think up to book like 8 or 9 where there was no swearing in it, and then was it you that told me this,
No, but
or he told me?
it was him.
Yeah, so I think they told me this. So Neil Helliger is his narrator in a there's two series. Well, there's more than two series, but the two main series are the Good Guy series and the Bad Guy series. And the character from the Good Guy series and the character from the Bad Guy series saw the same event. And in an attempt to make the Bad Guy series sound just like the Good Guy series, he used a small snippet from the Good Guy series in the Bad Guy series that had swearing. And so that's uh, the band-aid's off on that. Now I think in the most recent Bad Guys book, there's some swearing as well. But up until like book 8, I think you're good.
Yeah.
Oh, so my kids are into, you asked what other lit RPG. So and there you'd want your kids to be a little bit older, but my kids are doing Noobtown. And there are swear words in Noobtown. And there's Otto Sherman, who's like a little bit of a freak.
Yeah.
And I'm not describing him that way. He's self-described in the story as a freak. But I think my older kids are 11 and 13, and so they're able to handle that.
Yeah. And a lot of stuff like Otto Sherman, I don't know if they'll understand
No,
what
it doesn't get
he's
graphic. Yeah.
yeah. He just mentions like tying up chickens to use as part of something, and you're like, no.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
there's
I
some
don't
weird stuff, Otto Sherman, but
they're odd ducks. But going back to artwork, I love the cover of your book.
thank you.
Um, and when I messaged you, you mentioned that someone gave you advice.
Yeah.
Um, so what is that advice?
So can I take a step
Yes,
back?
go for it.
So I will say that I spent a good part, I've always wanted to write a novel. And I started with kids books, and I write under my real name for the kids books. And I also work with kids, which is why I write under a pen name. Because I'm shameless. I'm like I tell all my friends and family about my book. Here, you should buy this. But I don't necessarily want everybody to, because I work with kids, right? There's some people out on the internet that, maybe I wouldn't want to find me. Um, so where am I going with this? Oh yes. So I spent a good part of my 20s trying to write the next great American novel, right? And when you do that, there's like an awful lot of pressure, and honestly, the technology wasn't there. I use, and I want to be very clear about this. I use AI for research, not to write things, but I use AI for research and also for graphics to inspire my descriptions, right? So if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
instead of seeing like a landscape, right? Prime example, and I actually pulled it up here, is I did some research on ships during the age of exploration, right? I wanted to like because I'm not an expert on nautical vessels, right? And so I did, all kinds of research on, what ships have three masts, what have two masts, right? Like, what is that thing that sticks off the front called? Um, and so I used AI for a lot of research. I used AI for some graphics, and so the picture, and it's changed a little bit. This isn't the final cover, but the original part of the picture came from AI, and then I took it into Photoshop and I've modified it a lot, extended it, and I this is the original cover, and I talked to Jeff Hayes from Sound Booth Theater, and I just gave him a copy of the book and was like, hey, if you want to read this, that'd be great, and he said, hey, have you ever thought about hiring a typographer for your cover? And I wrote back and I said, well, I hadn't up until that exact moment. And so Jeff's a great guy, and we've talked a couple of times on my podcast. And there's some back and forth. He's great about giving me some advice about publishing my first novel, and he recommended somebody for the, typographers can do a lot of different things, but it was mostly for the lettering. And what it looked like. And this person did a fantastic job. And I'm just so happy with the cover. And I liked the original cover. It's not the first time I've designed things. And I was like, this looks pretty good. But it wasn't until I saw like a professional do the lettering, that I thought that I got to go with this.
If you have a picture of the original cover, like a digital file, and then the new one, I'll put them on screen so people can
Cool.
see what you're talking about. Because it's really fascinating, like how much something that simple changes the whole look.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, I can't say enough good about the typographer, and I will be reaching out to her again for book two.
Um, so you have book two as a like there will be a book two on Amazon. Um, so I know you haven't finished it yet, but do you have a time frame in mind um for when you want it done?
Yeah, so it's hard as a person with three children to really say exactly when I'm going to get anything done, because they're in borrowed, I write during borrowed moments. I wish I could be one of those people that writes, 1,600 words a day, which is the goal, right, for me. Um, but it doesn't always happen. I coach teams. I'm on boards. I have a job. I have a wife. So, I have a house. I have a dog who's sleeping back here. Um, so, the first one took me 9 months, but I was also producing a full season of the podcast, 50 episodes, while I was trying to write, while I was trying to market on Royal Road. Um, I am gonna try to clear myself away from all of that. I'm not doing a season six right now of the podcast. I'm not gonna do anything else on Royal Road. I'm gonna post on Royal Road, but I'm going to post within the original story. So I already have, I'm on the second pages. I'm not trying to blow my own horn here, but I'm on the second page of best rated, and I'm going to leave it there. I'm not. I don't. You really have. If I had created a new tome inside of a new book inside of Royal Road, there's that process of sort of doing like shout out swaps and review swaps and like trying to get on Rising Stars. And that takes a lot of time. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of time. I won't go into that here because that's not what we're talking about, but I don't want to do that for this book. I just want to write. Um,
Have
and
you
you know,
thought about like a Patreon or something where you can have a very select audience
I
who's
have,
there?
yeah, yes, I have, and someday maybe, but you have to have a good backlog for
Yeah.
Patreon, and I don't have a huge backlog right now. It's everything I can do to just put it on Royal Road early. But I love my Royal Road audience. They're good people, and they've really helped, especially a few people who comment on every chapter and point out things that I need to get right. And eventually, if I can get into a routine of writing again, the first chapters of a new book, at least in my experience, I'm not an Eric Ugelin like we've talked about. I'm not a Matt Dinniman.
Yeah.
But I think especially book two is going to be from four different points of view. That's the plan right now, and it's they each there's a main story, but they each have like an arc that they need to go through, right? And to start that arc, to start any arc is hard. The first part is the hardest part, right? Once you're
Yeah.
into the story, the whole story is mapped out, so that's not an issue. But you gotta get into the feel of the character. Like I put out something on Royal Road, told from Theoden, the
Oh, you froze a little.
castle, um, where she basically had to open the. Oh,
Okay, you're good. You're
am I
back
here
now.
now?
Yeah.
Okay,
You're
yeah.
good.
What
Sorry.
was the last thing you heard? Yeah, it's okay.
Theoden, she was doing
Yeah, okay.
something.
Yeah, so the first chapter that I tried to write in book two was from Theoden's point of view. She's one of the main characters of obviously she's one of the main she's my favorite character from book one, but she gets to tell part of her story. But that brings with it, like, okay, so now I have a character who's been in the world for hundreds of years and who knows a lot more than Bren does. So I have to know that as the author, right? So there's that, and then getting someone like Theoden's perspective correctly. She's like, she's a Spitfire, I guess. Is that I don't usually use that term, but I think that's the term that they would use for her. And she's awesome. And when I wrote the chapter, it was the chapter where Bryn is up on the top of the wall doing something, the Morrigan's somewhere else doing something else, the God of Magic somewhere else doing something else. And Theoden has a very specific role, a very important role that was going to change the tide of the situation. And so I told, the prologue was that I went back in time and told that story. And I realized when I was done with it that it wasn't told from Theoden's perspective. It was told from her point of view, but it was told with Bren's voice, because
Uh,
I had just written a whole book from Bren's voice, right? It was, and so that's tough, when you're maybe more experienced than I am. You can do that. You can just flip a switch and do that, but I can't yet.
I'm with you. I cannot do that. Also, I have a bit of ADHD. So I have a hard time caring if I switch too often, you know. So I get
Yeah. So
lost in books that are large casts. So
yeah. Well, you'd think, I mean, I've heard people say like, "Oh, I had trouble of like keeping track of like who everybody was," but they're rolled, in this book it's like basically anytime they go to a new city, they meet new people, right? As you would expect. And I think it's slow enough that, people on Royal Road who are reading a book as you're writing it and they're reading it over 4 months, that can be tricky. I don't know that you'd struggle if you're just reading it through. I also have like a family tree in the book and on my website that people can look at. You know, um,
now I have to go look at it because the gods get a little bit muddled in my brain because they all have really cool names and I can't remember them.
Yeah, it's like reading like Dostoevsky, right? Like any Slavic literature, like, well, this guy's name starts with an R, and so does this guy. Is it the same guy? I can't remember.
No, I feel that. I feel that so much.
Yeah.
So, um, going into this idea of names and pronunciation, and your narrator did a phenomenal job of capturing, like, as an American, me as being an American sounding, like, um, a very Gaelic tone, a very Welsh tone. Um, so that's very well done on his part.
Can I
Where,
comment on that really quick?
yeah, go for it.
So I had no idea um, like how much work goes into um, deciding what voice to use.
Yeah.
So I was so my narrator is a friend. We went to college together, and I didn't just like stumble across him.
Mhm.
Like I we played D&D together. He's a classically trained actor. Like he moved to California after undergrad, did his like graduate degree in acting. He taught acting. He was a professor for a while. Like he's involved with theaters out in the Berkshires. Um, he's like an actual actor. Like, and he does voice work for um some podcast that's like much larger than mine. So he's legit. But like when I mentioned this to him and he expressed interest, I was just like, well, you sound like my friend. Like that's all I could hear. And so I actually auditioned other people, and and I was like, I would share those recordings with loved ones, and they would be like, no, Chris is the best. Like by far. And to be fair, he's always gotten the main character, Bryn. He's always understood him. He's always like the snark, the like the humor underlaying all of this. He's always got it. And we were talking about a voice. I think it was Tig's voice, and Tig is a changeling, and because one of the rules of Annwn is nothing ages in Annwn, a lot of the changelings have to come over to Eru, Earth, to sort of grow old, right? To become
Mhm.
more mature, to age. And he was like, well, his voice is a little bit different because I would have guessed that he needed to spend a little bit more time. Like he didn't just pop out of the heart-shaped pool fully formed. Like he needed to go like he spent more time in Ireland, right? So he sounds more like this. And I was like, wow, like that's like that, there's a lot of thought that goes behind the scenes to decide what voice to use.
He did so well. And I was like, oh, you must have like spent a lot of time in Ireland or the UK to like get this sound. So, um,
He's just much more talented. I think I interviewed him on episode 50 of my podcast, and I think I started when I was asking him questions by saying, I want to start by saying that I have none of your talents. Right?
oh
I can I
goodness.
can I can write, but I can't act, and visual art. If I could show you my Tyrion up here, you would be like, maybe you stick to writing.
I'm sure you're better at it than you think you are, but
Well, thank you, Dakota. I knew that I liked you.
did he come to you and ask, like, how do you say these names? Or, like, what do you want them to sound like?
Yeah, so that was a bit of a thing. So I hired an Irishman, to. I had my whole list of words, right, which
Mhm.
kept growing as I wrote. But there's about 80. I think there's 86 words on the first novel that I hired somebody to say, and I
Mhm.
provided that on my website. Started off, I was giving them to Chris first, but then I put them on the Reader's Compendium, I call it, on the website, where you can see the words and the pronunciations, but you can also listen to this guy say, like an Irishman, say the words. What's funny about that is like probably an eighth to a quarter of the words aren't actually Gaelic, right? They're probably like some form of Brythonic, right?
Yeah.
Either they're Manx or Welsh. Um, but anyway, so I would, so I'd say the first three quarters he got from one guy, and then the guy, as I kept writing, I would go back to him and be like, "Hey, can you do these words too?" And there was like a moment where he didn't respond, so I hired somebody else to do the whole list,
Yeah.
and I put the new list up, and Chris was like, "These are all different." Like, can you give me the original list? I'm like, yes, I can do that. And so the list that I have up on there now was not the same list that I had started with, but you know, I they sound right to me. But I think I am gonna have to do some sort of like real compendium. Like, okay, now it's not how these guys are pronouncing it for book two. It's like, how did Chris pronounce it? And
Oh
so
yeah,
you know,
that makes sense. Um, I cannot believe how much research you did into this book. And this seems like a full-time job to me, like researching all this mythology and the language and like,
well, that's where the tools that didn't exist in my 20s exist now for very quick research, right? Um, and I will say, like, the hardest part of writing a fantasy story, I think, is like deciding if there's gods, you need like a pantheon. And if if you're in a different world, you need a map of that world. Um, my dog is waking up now.
oh,
Hey, would you like to come say hi? So he's this is Severo. Severo is named after a character from Red Rising. Hi, buddy. Yes. Hello.
he's so
Uh,
tall.
he's very tall. Yep. Um, so where was I going with this? What were we talking about?
Research.
Research, yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I had and it was tough with Irish mythology because like in one version like this guy's dad and the other version like it's switched. So I had to just like I had to like without crapping all over Irish mythology, I needed to come up with a family tree that was mostly right. If that makes sense. So that's what I did. I standardized on like one family tree and one map, and then the story goes from there. And you know, of course, I add on to it. And the idea is that thank you. The idea is not that the family tree that I provided in book one or the map that I provided is complete,
Mhm.
right? The map is what you need to know in order to read this book, right? As you drill into a certain area, sure, there are smaller towns, right? Did the Tua have other changeling offsprings? Absolutely. But if I had put them all on the first family tree, people would have been like, "What the hell is this? This is too much."
Necessary information only right now. That's
Right.
that's the best way to go. I love that you actually narrowed it down to like trying to follow a single family line because like I just the sheer number of versions of like tales that I know is absurd. And it could be family to family telling it differently in the same town, you know. So
Hi, several.
he loves you.
Okay. All right. Go lay down now. Go on. Go lay down. Yes. Yeah. So as far as like the history goes,
Mhm.
so my two most recent, I have a whole shelf of books over here, but my two most recent books were the Book of Invasions and a book that was recommended by a Tolkien professor that I know, Dimitri Fimi, called Ireland's Immortals. And so I delved into those a little bit. Um, but not a huge amount, right? Like they were more reference books than anything. I didn't just read them. Oh, I did read the Book of Invasions, but the other one, not so much. But yeah, the other thing I tried to do is there are four like main Irish cycles, right? There's um, there's the mythological cycle. There's like the Finian cycle, the Ulster cycle, and I forget what the fourth one is, but the four cycles represents the age of mythology, the ones that talked about war, the ones that talked about heroes, and the ones that talked about kings. And so what was cool is I was delving mostly into the mythological cycle, but I had a Royal Road reader. For a while, I was like trying to encourage people to leave feedback and to do ratings and stuff. And I was like, hey, if you do a rating, drop me a note and let me know. And then as like a reward, I'll let you influence the story, or I'll send you a poem from like my sage Morius. And one person took me up on that and was like, okay, I need you to tell this guy's tale. And he was from the age that talked about the heroes. He was a
Mhm.
part of what was called a Fianna. I'm probably butchering the name, but you know so you hear just a glimpse of like he like runs by the main character and you meet so the Fianna, which is a great like I was like as I researched this guy, I was like this needs to be in my story, right? So the you have like political things that are happening from the king, and those are going to have societal repercussions, right? You're going to
Mhm.
have people that are unhappy about those things and people who band together who are collectively unhappy about those things. And that is the Fianna in this case, right? So I was able to like draw on the Age of Heroes or the cycle that talks about the heroes and bring in this concept of a group of people who not all of them are gods, right? In fact,
Yeah.
most of them are not gods, but they're the people who are upset about what's going on, who travel around and do things. And you know, there's just so much to draw on that feeds the story.
It just it just boggles my mind how much there is behind this story, and like you could probably have written 7 books and not covered most
I
of it,
just might.
Um, so you bring up Morius, and he is probably my favorite, because he's like an old scholar who's like, let me tell you though.
Oh yeah, yeah. He could tell you, he could talk your ear off about the kind of tea that he was drinking, or, you know, the first time he sat down at a fountain, or yeah. I've had people say like, I think you guys need to do like you know, like a solo book just for Morius, you know, so he can just like finally sit down and talk about things because they are moving pretty quickly through the world.
Yeah.
But he is that like he's called a sage. That some people call him like a scholar, but he's like a there's 4 main cities, you know, and they do work out kind of like a plus sign, I think is how I described it, or a cross geographically. And each city used to have a sage. They don't have sages anymore. Morius is the last surviving sage that we know of, and you know, so he's been around for a really long time. You know, at one point, Bren was like, as he was like processing the rules of Anun, which the rules of Anun, I know I've covered one of them in the past, but I think it's important to know the rules. The rules are Anun is the source of all magic, nothing ages in Anun, and gods never die. And Morius tells Bren those rules as a way to sort of like understand the magic realm, the other world. And he's been around for a really long time and has experienced, you know, what it means to live in a magical world, and he's experienced the rise and fall of the Tuatha. He's experienced having to leave that world for fear of his life. And he's experienced and seen the relics, the 4 treasures. And so he's a really interesting character that is able to sort of fill in the stuff that Bryn doesn't understand. And then you have Theoden who like pokes fun at him because, right, because Morius is like, oh wow, that's interesting, and Theoden's like, you think is everything is interesting.
Early in the book, she's like, how many times are you going to say interesting? You're good.
Sorry about that. Hey, lay down, bud. Lay down. Yeah.
Yeah, she's like, how many times are you going to say interesting? And he's like, oh, that's pretty interesting to think about.
Hey, hey, hey. Maybe we give him a second to
Yeah,
calm
you're
down
fine.
here. Go lay down. It's okay. Go lay down. Hey, shh. Lay down. Go lay, go lay down, bud.
It's okay. In the winter, my door
Mm.
to my office doesn't close all the way sometimes, and my dog can just push it open. So I have to like barricade the door. And if he's determined, he's getting through.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this guy's 130 pounds. So hey, go lay down. It's okay. It's okay. Go to sleep. Go rest. Shh. Hey, go lay down. Go lay down. It's okay. It's okay. Thank you for protecting me.
Oh.
He's like, oh, I'm gonna lay right next to you because he's
Well,
scared.
yeah, you might not be safe.
I know. I think he's like, I'm a little bit nervous.
Um, yeah, so I think the interactions between some of your characters are beautiful, right? They're just very funny, and it goes back to that idea of lit RPG as a funny genre where terrible things can happen
Yeah,
as you wear the Matt Denim and Apocalypse shirt.
yeah, yeah. We haven't talked about Ruodon yet. And as like a character, Rue is, you know, in the beginning, you see Rue as like one kind of character, but I think as he by the time you finish the book, you realize he's somebody else entirely. And without giving anything away,
Yeah.
he's another fun one to write.
He very much, when you first meet him, comes across as like the classic trickster. And when Bren tries to like read his stats, he's like a magical ring. It says something really funny. What does it say?
Remalama Ding Dong for his name. Yeah, yeah,
Yes. And I was like, wait, did I hear that right? And I had to go back and listen to it again.
yeah. He's like, go ahead, read my stats, Runt. And he calls Bren Runt, even though Bren's taller than him. Um, yeah, he's just
Yeah.
got that personality.
Yeah, so he's a really fun one. And also complicated, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
He has this one line in Gorius that's one of my favorites where he says, Bren is like flabbergasted because of some sort of magical protection to the Gorius vault. And he's like, what? Have you never been inside a magical realm? Or have you never been inside a magical vault inside of a castle inside of a magical realm before? And Bren is like, really?
that's the other thing is he actually lived in the mortal world, right? And so it feels like a common friend to Bren. Like somebody he has like a touchstone to more than just Morius is like, oh, you know some of the things I know. And they talk about movies at one point. Um,
Yeah, there's a Captain Planet reference. There's no
so
pop culture reference left unturned here.
um so that leaves the last main character as the worm, I believe.
Oh, Monty.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
every lit RPG that's really good has to have a silly side character, uh, pet type thing. So tell us about Monty.
He's what's called an illifished, which they refer to him as a devil worm or a devil snake, right? They're looking for ways to describe him, and it's a thing in Irish mythology, like it's a real creature. Um, and so it's just a cool concept. I kind of elaborated on it a little bit in the book, but he ends up with this baby Illifished who saves him. He's hanging on the edge of this cliff, and I don't want to give too much away, but like he's about to fall off, and this little Illifished comes to his rescue, and they're both so tired that they end up like Bren just collapses, and he wakes up in the morning, and the little Illifished is still sleeping on his chest, and but he's like they can't communicate right away because they're unbound. He's an unbound minion. They eventually become bound and they can communicate telepathically. But some things need to go down for that to happen. And so like they're just trying to like they can't understand each other and they're like trying to flush out. Bren's like, you need a name. And so I think he goes through like he's like Sir Mix-a-Lot, and the snake looks like he's gonna bite him, and and anyway, so he ends up like as like a Monty Python reference. He ends up naming him Monty, which he approves of. But he's a fun character too, and he's like the classic like remind me to tell you about the rules that I have. And he's like, can I eat the rules? Um, he wants to eat everything. And I described him intentionally as like, I want to see if Chris can do this. I'm like, he sounds like a higher pitched Andre the Giant, right? So I'm like, let me see if he can do that voice.
Well, he's going to get older and then he's going to be a normal Andre the Giant, you know?
He's gonna get big. Yes. Yes. So the Illifists are huge. I think I described them as like the size of a couple of, school buses. The first Illifist you meet is not cute like Monty. She's rather scary, or she. It's you learn. I think Theoden teases Bren at one point. It's like, why are you calling him a him? He's not a him. He's like, they reproduce asexually. Like, what are you doing?
Um, they remind me a lot of the worms from Dune, just like in the sheer size.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Not that you want the worms from Dune in your world. So,
No, that's true. Yeah, you never know what's going to happen. You may be prophetic in your description. You never know.
so one of the last things I want to talk about in the book is Bren, being so young, actually has an interest in women, and he meets a woman on a ship. And she is a magical creature, and she gives him a little seashell. So talk about the meaning of the seashell, I guess.
So at that point in the book, Bren is like losing because in Anun they don't keep time.
Yeah.
There's no like clocks, and they don't keep time the same way. And so he's actually starting to lose track of like what day it is and what time it is. But he remembers like, oh, it's like Christmas Eve. And Fern is the character, and I won't talk about like what kind of creature she
Yeah.
is, not creature, what kind of humanoid she is, what kind of fae actually is the term I used in the book, because there's lots of different species of fae, and she like knows enough about Eru that like she knows that it's like a gift giving holiday. It's like Christmas Eve, and so things happen. They have saved each other's lives, and and have developed. I'm not a romance writer. I'm
Mhm.
not trying to write like classic romance, but
Yeah.
he's definitely taken with Fern. Her full name is Ferna Wynn, and she gives him what's called a shell of promise, which her species of fae they only get one shell of promise, and it's a very special thing for her to have given to Bren. And the shell is, if you essentially the old thing, like if you hold a seashell up to your ear, you can hear the sea. So the way this works is it's the shell kind of listens for you in a way. So if you submerge this shell into salt water, the person that gave you the shell knows exactly where you are and can come find you. And so it's a plot device as much as anything, but it's also meant to be like, Bren is like, she just puts it in his hand, and he's staring at her and
Yeah.
doesn't even really know what it is, and he takes it back, and Rue's like, wow, she gave you her shell, huh? That's pretty special. And he's like, I don't know what that is, but okay. Yeah. And the other thing I will say, and this isn't like a political move on my part. Celtic mythology, the to borrow a phrase from Dan Brown, the sacred feminine is like Celtic mythology, the mothers and yeah, the matriarchy is like super important.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of characters in my book are male, but that's because of that's what the Tuatha De Danann
Yeah.
It's that's what I was given essentially from the tales. But like Theoden is one of my main characters. Bridget turns out to be like a really big character in this story. And Fern has a large part to play in this, and that's what I'm hoping to bring out over the next couple books is just like how important the matriarchy and the tripart, like Morgan is like that tripart goddess, right? That's a really big thing in Celtic mythology, and I want that to come out.
I think even though there are a lot of male characters, predominantly just because the main character's male, like it did not feel overly Tolkien where it's just men, right? So you did very
Yeah, I
well
mean,
to balance.
thank you. And part of it, like people write what they know, right? So
Hmm.
I'm male, and my main
Yeah.
character is male. And now I'm gonna have my work cut out for me in the second book where I'm writing from Theoden's point of view, but I'm gonna do my best.
So the last thing about Fern is she gives Bren a title or a last name. And it feels like a defining moment for his character in the first book. So do you want to talk about like what that kind of was and how you
Sure.
decided?
Yeah, so the concept of an epithet is like a cool, really cool thing. You get so Nuada Argitlam, right, is like the main king. That he calls himself the Over King, right? And that should tell you something about him. But but Argitlam, it means of the silver hand, right? So it's this idea of a last name. It's not a surname, but it's more of a title that has become over the years like a last name, and so that's kind of how Bren uses. So Fern gives him the name Bukil, which means protector. And let me tell you, I researched and researched and researched like what name I wanted to use. So his brother's name in the story, and we haven't talked much about Kai, but Kai Makan like has this ring to it, and I really like as soon as I saw Makan, like I was like, oh, that goes well with Kai. Like that's his epithet that which means something different. I'll let you discover that from the book. Um, but Bukil means protector, and I think that is a defining moment for him. They're on a ship. Something bad has just happened, but also something good. Um, you know, and and Fern is, and he's also just discovered that the last name that he thought was his last name, he's been living this world, this life for 4 years in Eru, and Morius has been like, "Oh no, your last name's Callahan," and then something happens, and he finds out like, "Oh, what do you mean Callahan's not my last name?" And Morius is like, "Well, but I thought I told like when I told you like your origins, you would realize that your last name is not Callahan." Hi there. And so Fern, having overheard this, essentially gives, and after something happens, pretty important, Fern kind of just falls upon this title, and Theoden's like, "Oh, I like it, lady," like, "Oh, she's into it," and anything Theoden likes is what happens.
Yes. Um, I don't know. I just thought that was such a beautiful moment to like help say you're no longer a kid in this world.
Yeah.
You're an active participant, you know.
Yeah,
So
there's a funny part too where I think it's funny. I make myself laugh. That's isn't that our job as an author, right? To make ourselves laugh. Where it's like he's like, I've never had an epithet before, and Morius is like, if you had an epithet before, it would have been pain in the arse.
yes, that sounds right.
Yeah,
Um, so uh at the beginning I mentioned we'd get back to your podcast. So tell people a little bit about what the long-winded one is. You've mentioned it a few times, but just so everybody gets a good idea.
sure. Well, The long-winded one is whatever it happens to be for the season, which is not a great thing for like a business model, because it's not a business; it's a labor of love. I don't put sponsors on my pod. Not I could have a sponsor, but the podcast in the first three seasons was a serialized. We essentially chopped up some actual play D&D episodes that we played, and I interspersed them with three seasons of 150 episodes of interviews of Tolkien experts and historians and authors, and I fell in love with the interviews. And so when it came time to do another season, season four, I switched gears to Forgotten Realms, and I was like, you know what, this is going to be different. We're going to do like I wrote scripts and I gave them to my D&D friends, and they all played parts, and we did this dramatized um, 50 episode arc set in Symbia in Forgotten Realms. And so there, of course, I was like, I did all the homework. I read all of the Symbia novels. And then I interviewed all the Symbian authors and had them on the podcast. And I got to sort of end the season with the creator of Forgotten Realms, Ed Greenwood, which was super cool. And then a couple of years went by, and I was like, and I'm basically at that point, I've only been reading lit RPG, and I'm like, huh, I kind of want to do another season, and it makes sense that it's got to be lit RPG, right?
Yeah.
And of course, because I'm a glutton for punishment, I was like, what else can I do? I'll just write one while I'm doing season six. Um, but there's nothing like a little bit of pressure, to actually follow through with it. I had said publicly I'm going to write a novel. I told everybody I'm going to write a novel, and by God, I wrote a novel.
And it turned out wonderful. Like, don't forget that last bit. Like,
Thank you.
it's important.
Thank you. It's again, it's not the kind of book you want to base like a business like model around, right? So because it's like it's a mythology that people are unfamiliar with. There are unfamiliar words in it. It's not super crunchy for the lit RPG fans, but it resides in a very unique place. There's not a lot of people writing Celtic lit RPG out there. In fact,
No.
it may be the only one that I know of. But it's not too much. Like you don't have to come into the book knowing, what the Tuatha are, right? If you do, great. If not, I try to spoon feed everybody, including myself. I was spoon feeding myself as I was writing.
I don't know very much about Celtic mythology at all, so I felt like it was very accessible and it definitely you worked really hard, it feels like, to explain who these people are um in a very accessible way. So thank you so much for helping me.
Thank you. Well, I had interviewed a lot of people who were authors and who had published on Railroad, and I had like one major goal when I came out of this. I didn't want anyone to say he does a lot of what is it? Telling, not showing, right? Like
Oh
that's
yeah.
a big thing, and I think it's just like a thing on Railroad. Like people have read it so many times that they're like, "Oh, that's what I'm going to say about this person's novel." So it's a thing, but it's also like a thing, if you know what I
Yeah.
mean. Like it's like, well, that's my one criticism with this is they did a lot of telling, not showing, and my goal was to like not do that, like to not have anybody say that about my work. So I didn't want to be Anne Rice, and there's nothing wrong with Anne Rice. I grew up an Anne Rice fan, but like you could actually skip like 4 pages sometimes
Oh,
of
oh God, yeah.
description. And so it's not like that, but I really tried to like paint this other world because we've never been there, you know?
Yeah. Well, I'm super excited for book two, and you don't need to be the superhuman who finishes 7 books in a year. Like, I'll read it when you put it out, I promise. So,
Thank you, because it might take a while, but my goal is, I want to write a couple of chapters a week, and if I do that, I'll be happy. And if I get under 9 months, which was how long it took before, I'll be happy with that as well.
well, um, if anybody hasn't read yet, The Children of the Cold Moon, I highly suggest it. The audiobook was phenomenal. And I'm really excited for the next one. And also go check out Jared's podcast, The Longwinded one.
Thanks very much, Dakota. And it probably, if they're listening to your podcast now, they also know that we had a very fun interview
Yes.
with you and Max from the Crit RPG podcast, and that's actually the first time we've talked, and it was a lot of fun, and I really appreciate you, um, having me back.
I love chatting with you. You're very knowledgeable, so thank you. Well, everybody, thank you so much and have a lovely day. We'll see you again next time. Bye.
All right, awesome.
Okay.